Really excited to have this next speaker because this is a really impactful topic. Let me introduce you to Yonathan Klijnsma. He's the head of threat research at RiskIQ, and he's going to talk about the inside Magecart, the history behind the covert card skimming assault on the e-commerce industry. Go ahead, Yonathan.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about Magecart. It's not something new. This is going to be more of an update, more of the things we've seen, more of the things that have happened since we originally published. My name is Yonathan Klijnsma. I'm the head of threat research at RiskIQ. Those bullets are not per se what I do. It's more what the team does. And I think there's one that's kind of overlooked. A lot of people think about threat research as, cool reports, cool publications, which is part of it. It's always really interesting. But we spend a lot of time with product as well. We pioneer new products. Some of the services that our company offers come from threat research. We also make improvements. It's kind of the glass half full version of it. I had when we find issues with our products, but marketing wanted me to say improvements. There's two ways to look at it. But we also try to do a lot of communication and work with other people because you don't have the full picture of everything. We try to have data on everything, but we don't always do. So RiskIQ has been around for a long time. We've officially been registered as a company since 2003. But we've been sort of more working as a company since 2009. The original years were for the founders to sort of have their pet project, and it kind of grew out of proportion, and they started to build a real company out of it. And what we do is internet reconnaissance. So we try to store, or we try to ingest everything we can find. So anything from the simple things like DNS or who is data. We have this, we do scanning. We ingest all of this, but our important thing of all the data we collect is our web crawling. So we do about 2 to 2.5 billion pages a day. We've been doing this for many, many years. We don't throw away data. We actually build more data out of those crawls. We have a lot of metadata around it. So we can tell you for the past decade what has happened online. And a lot has happened. And we use this data in different ways. Our products are more like lenses on our data sets. I know a lot of people are most commonly used to us by RiskIQ community or PassATotal, which is just raw access to our data. And we just have a lot of ways of using this. So Magecart is something that started with research in 2015. We tracked it back to 2014. Last year we did a publication on this called Inside Magecart. We highlighted sort of the history of how this card skimming started, how web skimming was pioneered, it was interesting to see. There was a bunch of criminals who was doing sort of server-side card collection. So they would breach the service, they would get access, and they would do the classic data breach on the inside. So you copy all the data and you steal it. These guys had noticed that it's, very often is very, very hard because not everybody's infrastructure is the same. You have to learn what's going on. You have to know where the data is. So they figured, why not do it on the web side of things? Everybody has e-commerce. Pretty much every large retailer has e-commerce. There's a lot of cards that are being used there, so we can go for them. So in about 2 to 3 months, they pioneered a small piece of JavaScript, I think it was 20, 25 lines, to generically skim any sort of payment page. They wouldn't get everything, so it's not 100%, but it was generic enough to say 80 to 90% of the pages that you use online for e-commerce transactions, they were able to skim payment data off of this. So as I said, it's web skimmers. They run on the browser side, so it's nothing on the server side. And this initial group built this in 2014. They started selling it in 2016, which is also the first year we saw more groups starting to do this. And it kind of grew from there. It's really, really big. We have 15 groups we can actively track, so we can actively identify them. That's not everything there is. We have a large pool of data of different guys using the same base code, because you can basically buy a sort of base kit to do web skimming. It's anywhere from $250 to $1,000, depending on how much support you want or how fancy it has to be. 15 groups we can identify. Thousands are doing this on the side as well. We can't identify them on their own. We do see them, we detect it, which is good. We just can't group it. We can't attribute anything together. It kind of becomes one big pile. Now, what's also kind of interesting is if you look at the history, obviously if you make up the name of something, you'll be the first to reference to this name. So you can see a small blip at the beginning, which is our first publication. And from there, we did some more publication, not a whole lot of attention. The general response on most of it was data breaches happen and data gets stolen. And then we did Ticketmaster, which for the UK was kind of a big deal, until British Airways hit, which is kind of a big spike. Newegg happened at the same time. A little bit after we published our report, we published some more breaches. There's more stuff in there that I didn't highlight. We did a big publication about Amazon breaches, which I'll highlight in this presentation as well. But you can kind of see it becomes more of a used term, and it's not about the term for us. That was just a name we needed internally because we have multiple people working on this, and you need a term for something if you want to refer to it. We use it for publications, so people would kind of have a name for it. But Magecart is just a concept of web skimming. And we don't give fancy names. I know there's a lot of companies that have really fancy names for actors. We call them Magecart Group 1. For us, that means the web skimming group that is Group 1 that we know of and we have identifiers for. So one interesting thing about this, if you look at the grouping, we have Group 6. We can now say this is what other people know as Fin 6. The reason we can say that now is IBM X-Force finally published an article about this. Fin 6 is a really interesting group. They are professionals at what they do. If they get into your network, they will know more about your network than you will. They are the administrators you would like to hire. It's their thing. They take quite their time to learn what's going on, learn where information is stored, how information is processed. Once they have this access, they put everything in place, start their play. That's what they did at British Airways. That's why originally they saw web skimming. That's what they admitted to. That's what we then published on with detail. It wasn't until later, I think 3 or 4 months later, that they decided to also say, well, there's about 108,000 cards additionally compromised from static payment storage. And that's exactly what these guys are good at. They will know where everything is, put everything in play, and you can basically assume if they had full access, if they had domain access somehow, or at least high privilege access, they will have known where everything is you store. That's kind of their thing. And they were the group behind British Airways, as well as Newegg. Newegg was something they had longer access to, but they didn't know what to do about it yet. And they got web skimming as a new sort of tool in their arsenal, because they have point of sale skimming. They have a whole bunch of tools they use during breaches and stealing of data. Web skimming was just new to them in 2018. They developed a really simple web skimmer. They had access to Newegg for a while, and once they figured out how to do British Airways, they figured out how to do Newegg, because Newegg is an online retailer in the US, and they were a really big business. They kind of made one mistake, which is Newegg has their biggest revenue during like the Black Friday, kind of like the end of the year sales. They compromised them way before that, and it was cleaned up way before that. So they missed like huge potential income, luckily for us and Newegg. Now we also have Group 5. Group 5 is a really interesting group. They only target supply chain of the web. So they target suppliers that you might use on your website, which can be anybody who delivers ads on your website, to like loyalty programs, to basically like live chat support, anything that you use an external service for that runs scripts in the browser of your visitors, these guys target. We know about 20 or so suppliers that they hit. We know they have probably hundreds of thousands of victimized websites, because just one supplier they hit had over 100,000 victim websites. It's probably more victims from which card data was stolen. Now, the only thing is they have a shotgun approach. If you compromise a supplier, for example, an ad supplier, and you deliver your malicious code, it doesn't mean it runs on a payment page. So whatever they do, they won't always have access to payment data, which is good. But again, their shotgun approach works so well. It's so widespread. They've got some large breaches on their name, most of which we don't disclose. Ticketmaster was one. We did disclose, which was a whole big deal. They were hit through 2 supply chain attacks like this. They're not experts in breaching. They're actually really crappy at what they do, but it works. That's the thing. They are really old school. They will breach you using really old techniques, and they have really like crappy PHP shells they use. They just have a really poor way of doing OPSEC. But they get in. They go for the supply chain because it's easier. You don't breach a Ticketmaster, you breach a company that doesn't do security. Ticketmaster has security on premise. They have security teams, they have people patching. The 2 suppliers that they compromised to get on Ticketmaster did not. They didn't really do much besides know about the term OWASP, but that's as far as they got. Now, You also have Group 4. Group 4 is a really interesting group. They come from sort of the malware ecosystem, so the banking malware kind of side. That's where they sort of started a long time ago. They do web skimming as well. They're still around. They get really annoyed by us because we keep taking down their infrastructure and they don't know how we do it. And we publish about why we know what they do. We take it down, they try to change it, but we have a good in on how they set up their infrastructure, so we keep taking it down to kind of force them out of it, because it's really hard to arrest people like this, mostly because we know some of them are Russian-based, which, you don't really get arrested, but at the same time, you need to get evidence, and the previous talked about this a lot. You need to get evidence of them doing this, and that's the hardest part in a lot of this. Web injects, it's even farther away from the actual fraud that's happening, so for law enforcement, it's a really hard thing to go after. So what we do is we frustrate them. We try to sort of take out parts of their infrastructure. So sometimes we take the outside domains, or sometimes we take out the middle, because their infrastructure is all about proxies. So it's large chains of proxies with domains at the front, and we basically cut it in pieces every once in a while at different points. The idea is to frustrate them, to make them kind of stop because it becomes too expensive or too frustrating to actually continue. Because we don't see a lot of promise in trying to get specifically these guys arrested. Now we have the last group number on here. We haven't published about them. I put this in last night because we decided to do it anyway, because we will publish about them in the coming months. But they're a really interesting group. They're also very technical, like the Group 6 and Group 4. They are very specialized in what they've done. They've built a framework for skimming different ways. Sometimes you pull data from a page. Sometimes what they do is they actually remove the actual payment form and they put in their own form. So you're entering it in a form that they know about, so they know how to pull out the data. Their infrastructure is also really interesting. They look at their target. They figure out where these targets pull JavaScript resources from. They mimic the domains from anything those people use. The domains are registered at different registrars every time. It's on different hosting providers in different countries the whole time. It's very split up. You will not find them through overlap ever. They're just really, really careful about this. And we'll publish about this in the coming months. They're just a really interesting group, and it's more worrisome when the really technical people come in and try to do this stuff, because you can get a lot of data out of this. So the one thing is these groups are evolving over time. Since last year that we published very basic information because a lot of them were very basic. They were kind of all doing the same thing. They had the same code base, the same game basically. They're becoming more sophisticated because they're starting to understand how the web works. Sometimes a little bit better than us, which is a problem. And they also start to understand how we get at them because we publish about it. We publish about it because we have to educate each other. But they're reading this. We know they're actively reading this. Now, they're also trying to sort of move away from the generic, we can target everything kind of skimming. The original group made a skimmer that had this like 80 to 90% success rate. Right now what they're doing is they're generalizing and targeting with this. So a lot of these groups are making frameworks to do skimming in different forms, different ways, and then per victim, they put in the configuration for the skimmer. Instead of having one skimmer that knows what a payment form looks like and tries to find it. These guys are now profiling their targets more. They have frameworks in place, they put in the configuration, skimmer runs and works on these sites. So they're targeting by sort of generalizing. And they're also learning more about CMSs and like all the different sort of CMSs that people use for e-commerce, because there's a lot of them. Some are custom, but a lot of people rely on something that's been built by large organizations or open source projects. And some of them are really fast learners. So the two primary ways, and it's still the same, that we see skimming code being injected is either a direct compromise or a third-party supply chain attack. Direct compromise it's the standard topic. Something's vulnerable, they get in. We see basically three ways. So it's outdated systems or like misconfigured setups. Password reuse, which is really interesting. Some of them actively go through data breaches to get in. We know Group 5 has done this on some of the supply chain attacks. They just look up the company domain name for email addresses and data dumps and try to find common passwords to get in and sort of elevate from there, which is interesting. We also know some of them use unknown vulnerabilities, so you can call them 0 days, but they basically figure out some bugs in a CMS or a product that a company has running on-premise to get in. Fin6, for example, or Group 6, they do spear phishing, which is another way to get access. They just have a very slow path. They do spear phishing to get in and like slowly navigate the network and figure it out. Now, the third-party compromises, it's basically a direct compromise so that the list applies to those third parties. And it affects thousands of websites at the time. That's like the big problem out of this. It's a supply chain attack. Thousands of websites are relying on the supplier. It gets compromised. They get code running on there. And we still see it to this day pretty much constantly. And the supply chain of the web is not something a lot of people talk about. It's also not something super common. I don't even know if we made up this sort of word combination. But the thing is, it's grown organically. We wanted analytics, we wanted ads to monetize, we want CDNs, we want a whole lot of services for our website, but these all sort of make you vulnerable, or at least make the customers or visitors of your websites and services vulnerable to these attacks. And any external service you use is basically a target for any of these guys. It's a way to get on the website. They don't need to attack you because you can have your security teams, you can have everything patched. Your supplier won't. They get in, and companies like Ticketmaster who they have it set up really nicely internally, but third-party suppliers not so much. So with that, little case study. I know it's been discussed before, I know it's been published about, but there's a few interesting things. So Ticketmaster found the compromise because banks started reaching out. So they did an investigation, and I'm really impressed they actually managed to find a third party that was compromised. So they did an assessment. The assessment was nothing on our side changed, nothing on our side happened, and they were able to figure out that it was a third-party supplier. The reason they were able to figure it out was because it was still ongoing. They did not have history, which we do have. So we ended up publishing the full story. We extended their sort of timeline of the breach with another 3 months, which matched what the banks were actually seeing in terms of fraud. We also identified the attackers, which we kind of knew about before, which is Group 5, which is the ones that do supply chain attacks. But there's something interesting. So 2 suppliers were targeted or were compromised. The first one was Social Plus. They were compromised from December 2017 up until 2018, June. They were not targeted for Ticketmaster because Group 5 does not actually target besides doing third parties. Imbenta was another supplier that was compromised. They were compromised from February until June of 2018. They were targeted for Ticketmaster, which is really interesting. That's not something they do very often, or they've done since, actually. Now, the way we know this is if you look at the timeline, on the right, those are resources, JavaScript resources that they modified to add skimming code. Timestamp on the left is the first time that we observed these. You can sort of see them sequentially go through. So the first one is Hotel, which is like Booking.com with the interface of Skyscanner for people that know those sites. The second one, Klook, is another travel agency. But you can sort of see these dates like following up. One by one, they were modifying the script, seeing how much traffic they got, seeing if they got any card data out of this. And then it sort of stops on December 22nd when they hit Ticketmaster Germany. And then nothing until January 15, which is quite a long period of time. They hit Ticketmaster Australia. And then nothing. Even though Social Plus has hundreds more customers, they stopped. They saw they had Ticketmaster. It wasn't until February that somebody else was compromised. They took their time between January or January 15 somewhere and February 22nd, I believe, to look at Ticketmaster to figure out what other suppliers these guys use, and one of which was Imbenta, which they managed to get into. Imbenta, they modified different resources all for Ticketmaster websites. Again, sort of sequential, one by one, they figured it out. They tried to see, they put in the skimmer, check the traffic, be sure that they get something out of it besides exposure. And what's interesting, Imbenta has 500 plus customers. None of them were targeted besides Ticketmaster. These guys were completely narrow focused just on getting Ticketmaster once they had access to Imbenta. Imbenta was solely targeted because of Ticketmaster. One of the reasons was Social Plus doesn't have all sort of the Ticketmaster locations in different countries as customers. So if you have access to Social Plus, you only have a subset of the Ticketmaster websites. If you target Imbenta, you actually get the rest of them as well. That's sort of their thought process. But if you look in that list, This is a really small subset, but you can see banks and all kinds of things in there. So it could have gotten way worse, but luckily for us, they kind of narrow focused. Now, AWS is another interesting one. You might not really see it as like a supply chain on the web. It's an integral part of all the websites, pretty much. Anybody making a website almost, or large organizations, will use Amazon either directly or indirectly or some part of the service. Now, Amazon services, like I said, they're integral to companies. Their services require configurations. Configurations often come with security, and in the case of Amazon S3, for example, you get leaky buckets. If you look at any data breach story from the past 5 years, odds are the majority will involve Amazon S3. Because Amazon S3 is great for storage. I mean, at RiskIQ, we use it a ton. It's really nice. The only thing is you need to set up access control for who has access to the data, who can read it, can write it, or delete it. That's sort of the very bare bones basics of their access control system. You can have specific identities, which can be users or IP addresses or specific API keys that can have certain types of access. But you also have the anyone option. Now, the anyone option makes a lot of sense for people who have websites where they host their images, their static content, their videos, basically, on an Amazon S3 bucket, and those get loaded in from there. So you give anyone read access. However, we also found out that a lot of contractors like to do anyone read, write, and delete access, because then it's super easy. If you're just at a Starbucks, you don't have to add your IP address, you don't have to log in. Anywhere you go, you can just go on there. So what they actually do, they give anyone read, write, delete access. What's great, you can enumerate S3 buckets, and you can check to see if you have these permissions. So there's a group out there that has been doing this since April. They basically just go through S3 buckets and they compromise them. We disclosed this, I think, 2 months ago or something. We did a publication. It kind of died down in terms of people paying attention to it. It's not gone. It's not gone at all. It ramped up after our publication, and it's still ongoing. These guys are just compromising buckets like constantly, probably right now. So if you make use of this in your organization, please check this. It's not about the public writable S3 buckets. It might be that you have a process internally in your company that makes use of S3 buckets that has this same issue. These guys will also get in. It's not just about the public-facing ones. It's the way they actually do this. If you have the classic bad guy on the left, they basically go through bucket by bucket, check the permissions. If they have the right permissions, they pull down any JavaScript file, and they add their skimming code to the bottom, and then overwrite the one in the bucket. And they've done this with thousands and thousands of S3 buckets. It was quite surprising to us how many people actually have this set up this way. And these get used on websites. We've seen it in a lot of places. And to give you an idea, this is one of them. So this screenshot is an S3 bucket with a specific script on there. That's sort of blocked with a lot of X characters like backslashes. That's the skimming code, just slightly obfuscated. This was loaded on time.com. So somebody had access to run scripts on time.com. That's a big deal. These guys were skimming, and time.com doesn't have payment data directly that way. But still, if they wanted to do different things, let's say you want to distribute malware. Time.com is a pretty good place to be. Time.com they get a lot of traffic. So these guys are very narrow focused on payment data, but let's say somebody evolves this, makes this a sort of trafficking service, and they give traffic to people that want to do card skimming if they're on a carding or a payment page, or otherwise do some, redirection to tech support or distribute malware, and do that on time.com. That's a big deal. And this is just one of them. We have seen a lot of big websites. We've seen a lot of places where you really don't want this to happen. And a large part of the reason is contractors. The reason with time.com was a contractor who made a World Trade Center 360-degree panorama-like page you could scroll around. Contractor did his job, gave them access. It was put up. He left his anyone read, write, delete access open. These guys found it, put it in their code. And yeah, we just see this way too often. So with that was my update. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Jonathan. I know I saw yesterday